Universal Casualty, Super Q,
los Miami Dolphins y tú, rumbo al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Son los Dolphins, nuestros Miami Dolphins, el team número 1 en toda la nación. Y son ellos orgullo de Miami y de todos los latinos en la capital del sol. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Este año no me hablen de los Redskins, no me hablen de los Chargers, ni de los Dallas Cowboys, porque los Dolphins son número 1 y lo demostrarán al llegar al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Nuestra línea está mejor que nunca y nuestra defensiva fue siempre la mejor. Y es por eso que yo no tengo duda que los Miami Dolphins ganarán el Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, con los Miami Dolphins, rumbo al Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins me voy para el Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins me voy para el Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins me voy para el Super Bowl. Con los Miami Dolphins me voy para el Super Bowl.
Universal Casualty
Y Super Q, los primeros. Bueno, caballeros, todo el mundo que cante con nosotros. Dame una D, dame una O, dame una L, dame una P, una H, una I, una N, una S, que es lo que tenemos, Miami Dolphins. Me voy para el Super Bowl. 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 Me voy para el Super Bowl.
You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network.
There's a team that's in our hearts. We've got love that won't depart.
Hello, Miami Dolphin fans, and welcome to the Same Old Dolphin Show, part of the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. I'm Josh Katzker. With me today and every day is my brother from the exact same mother, Aaron the Brain. Aaron, say hello to the people.
Hello to the people.
Brain, the 2023 Miami Dolphins season is in the books. Officially, it came to an end. And man, let me just get into this. The Miami Dolphins 2023 season has come to end, and it was perhaps appropriate that the final chapter of this season was written in the coldest game ever played in the history of the franchise. Because the Dolphins' once blistering hot offense finished off the season ice cold.
Oh, you're a pro.
Meanwhile, the Dolphins' shorthanded defense fought valiantly but simply couldn't do enough against the Kansas City Chiefs team and an elite quarterback in Patrick Mahomes that seemed completely undeterred by the elements. It was a familiar performance in a season that ended up feeling all too familiar to Dolphins fans of a certain vintage. Brain, they are still the same old Dolphins.
Without question. And I think it was like, look, we expected them to lose the game. We came into this game not expecting much from them, but we didn't expect that.
It was dire. It really, I said at one point, I think during the game, that you were really, there's a lot that goes into it. But at one point, I said something about, we were seeing pretty clearly the difference between a good NFL quarterback and an elite NFL quarterback. And we saw that on display in the game. Now, I don't want to get into the quarterback conversation right now because we're going to have that conversation. That's coming later. I promise. If you're tuning in, you're listening in, you want to hear the quarterback conversation, there is going to be a quarterback conversation. I assure you that that's coming. But it was, you really saw the difference between a team that decided we're not going to be deterred by what the elements are and the fact that this game is taking place in freezing cold. We're going to go out there and play our game. And another team that went out there and just, I don't know what it was that the Dolphins were doing, but they couldn't seem to execute very much of anything in this game. It was just a very clear demonstration, again, that the Miami Dolphins are not ready for prime time.
Yeah, and I think the most concerning part of it is that, look, you knew that it was going to be a struggle for the defense. You knew that the defense was going to be fighting an uphill battle with having 6 starters out, and they were just going to need to hold on for dear life. But you felt like, granted, Tyreek Hill's not 100%. You're playing Jalen Waddle. He's probably at like 70 to 80%. Mostert's not 100%. But generally speaking, your offense was reasonably healthy. And you thought, well, if the Dolphins are going to win this game, it's going to be on the strength of their offense, which was top 2 in the league this season. And if not for Tyreek Hill making a great play on a severely underthrown bomb, basically like a prayer that Tua threw up, the Dolphins get shut out in this game and never really get close to putting points on the board. They were basically blanked in this game offensively, and it calls into question, because if it was just this game, then it would be, you would hear a lot of, well, the elements. This team's not built for the cold. This team's not built for, outdoors, inclement weather. But this was the 3rd game in a row that the Dolphins played one of the 3 best teams in the AFC. And they got outclassed in all of them. And the offense really got outclassed in all of them. And that calls into question the entirety of the offense. So it calls into question not just your quarterback, not just your coach, but the way this whole thing has been built. We thought coming down the stretch when we were 11-4, forget 9-3, but even at 11-4, we thought even if we lose to Baltimore, this team is close. After what we've seen in the last 3 weeks, and injuries are a part of it, you know, you can't ignore it, but injuries aren't making up the difference here. When you get outscored 103-40 in 3 big-time games, one of them a playoff game, against your competition in your conference. You want to be considered on that level? You want to be considered a contender to win your conference and get to the Super Bowl? Well, when you get beat by 63 points over the span of 3 consecutive games, and frankly, it doesn't even look that close, then this team is a lot further away than we thought they were a few weeks ago.
Yeah, it was really, quite frankly, another embarrassing display from this offense. An offense that had been figured out. And the Dolphins finished the season 2-4 in their final 2-4 in their final 6 games of the regular season. Another late season collapse for the Miami Dolphins. 2 years running, that Mike McDaniel offense has been figured out, and the Dolphins haven't had solutions. So we're going to spend the bulk of this show basically talking about where we are and where things are now. Like, there's no point in rehashing all of the different elements of this game and talking about where the Dolphins might improve up for the next game, because there isn't a next game. And quite frankly, there was no, like, the narratives for the 2023 Miami Dolphins had been written prior to this game against Kansas City. That game against Kansas City sealed them. I think that a lot of the narrative that we're going to be talked about this team all off season, everybody already had them in the chamber. It was all ready to go, you know, and basically this Kansas City game was just, let's see if the Dolphins can somehow figure out a way to flip the script. And they did not. And so we basically had a page with all the writing on it that we were waiting on that last game to see how it was going to play out, to see if we needed to make any last edits. There were no edits to make, so we put the page through the laminator, and now it's done. It has been sealed. And now we're going to talk about where things go, where the Dolphins go from here after another season that ends in very disappointing fashion. But before we get into all of that, first off, a shout out to everybody watching on the Dolphins Talk YouTube channel. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us live. Smash that thumbs up button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, because it's a lot more good stuff coming your way all through the off season. Big things coming over here at Dolphins Talk and the podcast network. So make sure you're following along and subscribed on YouTube. Go ahead and smash that like button. Once again, appreciate it. Of course, a shout out to everybody, of course, watching on Facebook on the I Am a Miami Dolphin Fan Facebook page. It's not a group. I know Mike always calls it I Am a Miami Dolphin Fan Facebook group. It's not a group. It's a page. There's only like 3 people that can post anything on it. Everybody else, you're commenting. It's a page. Go like the page, though. And shout out to you if you're watching on the page. We appreciate it. And make sure you're visiting DolphinsTalk.com each and every day, your one-stop shop for all things Miami Dolphins all throughout the offseason. And download, rate, review, and subscribe to the Same Old Dolphin Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, everywhere that you get your podcasts. We appreciate that very much. So, Brain, Miami Dolphins finished the season going 2-4 in their final 6. Second straight season that they collapse. And this brings me back to one of our very first shows of this season. I think it was our preview show for this season, when we asked several questions that the Miami Dolphins were going to need to answer in the affirmative if they were going to be successful. And I think the biggest one, and it's one that I've come back to a couple times, is can Mike McDaniel come up with a plan B or a plan C if plan A doesn't work? And I think that question was asked on multiple levels, because it was first asked from the level of like just in-game management. And then it was also asked in a sort of broader sense, because if what you want to do isn't working, do you have something that you can pivot to? And I think what we've learned over the course of this season, a second straight year, the answer to that question, at least in 2023, was no. I don't think there was very much of a plan B. And there's a little bit of a narrative building on certain segments of Twitter, which, by the way, follow us on Twitter. I'm at Amplified Rock. He's at Aaron the Brain. That's at Aaron the Brain. Show is at SAME OLD DOLPHINS. There's a certain narrative building, and I'll read the tweet here, I think, from Louis Riddick, because I think it's insightful. And here's what he said. And if you are familiar with this, then bear with me. If not, I think this is good to hear. Louis Riddick tweeted, and this was 12:47 on January 15th. He said, when you build your team so you have to play a very specific style of game in order to have success, and you are not able to be multiple and able to adjust based on opponent, game flow, location, weather, etc., that is not just a QB discussion. That is a team-building discussion, a philosophical football discussion that starts at the very top. So I thought that was a really interesting tweet, and I think it's completely spot on. The fact of the matter is, this Dolphins team has been built to function a very specific way. And as we saw this season, when they were able to function in that specific way, they set the world on fire. They were unbelievable. They put up 70 points against the Denver Broncos, famously, in week 3 of the season, right? But we also saw that the old famous adage, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. What we saw was that literally when the Dolphins got punched in the mouth, they didn't know how to deal with it. They would get desperate and they would get off script, and things went south in a hurry. See week 4 at Buffalo. See week 17 at Baltimore. This was a team that struggled to cope with a lot of different things. Could not find a lot of variety. And so, Brain, I think any conversation, well, first of all, before we get into conversation and analyzing that, what are your takes on that message from Louis Riddick?
Yeah, I think there's credence to it. I think that there's a specific way that this team was built, and this team is very finesse. It's very, we're going to try to outsmart you, run around you, use speed. And it's not like it's a bad thing to have that in your arsenal. I just think that at a certain point, it's been proven over the history of this league that you have to have a counterpunch, no matter what it is. You could be the most smash mouth football team out there and you can run over everybody. But then if you don't have a quarterback that can make plays, eventually you're going to run into a team that will go all out, stop what you do running the football, and make your quarterback beat you. And if your quarterback can't beat you, you lose. By the same token, if you are a finesse team that is trying to run all around the edges and try to, scheme your way into the space and do everything that the Dolphins do with their talent to try to make everything perfect for the talent that they have, and a team that has both the talent and know-how to takes that away, at some point, you need to be able to just line up and play physical football and just say, okay, well, we're just going to take 3 yards because we can get 3 yards whenever we want to. And this team either can't do it or is scared that they can't do it. And if you're scared, you can't do it. So bottom line, they couldn't do it this year. Whatever the reason, whether it was because they weren't built well enough or because they didn't have the mindset because they were scared. That is debatable, but that's the fact. Whatever the reason, they couldn't do it. So they could only win one way. And when they played teams that were good enough and smart enough to take that away, they had no answer.
So I agree with you. So let's go back to that Riddick tweet and talk about why this team was built the way that it was built. Because I think there's a few answers. And I think one in particular is one that a lot of people aren't going to want to get into or aren't going to want to talk about. I don't want to dwell on that too much. I don't want to start there. Let's end there. But let's talk about some of these other reasons. So, Brain, first and foremost, what do you think is one of those reasons about why this Dolphins team was built to be so hyper-specific and operate in such a specific fashion?
Well, I think there's 3 reasons, but if you want me to just go with one and you want me to forego the obvious for the end,
yes,
I'm going to go with the offensive line.
There you go.
This team has struggled, to put it lightly, at putting together a quality offensive line that can protect the passer. And so Mike McDaniel takes over this team and he says, well, how do I devise an offense with the players that I have? And so he devises an offense that basically says, well, my offensive line can't protect the quarterback if he needs, can't give him more than 2 or 3 seconds to throw. So I need to devise an offense that allows the quarterback, or basically relies on the quarterback, throwing the ball in 2.5 seconds or fewer. And that's where we are.
Yep. So that's one reason. There's another reason, which is that I think Chris Greer and Stephen Ross made a decision that they needed to go all in right now. And they made that decision, right? As soon as they went out and they spent all that draft capital to bring in Tyreek Hill within weeks of bringing in Mike McDaniel. They went out and they traded for Tyreek Hill. Following that first season with Tyreek Hill, they went out and they spent more to bring in Jalen Ramsey.
Well, not even.
Well, actually, not even then. Towards the end of that first season with Tyreek Hill, they spent a bunch of money and assets to bring in Bradley Chubb.
That cinched it.
And that was we kind of felt in that moment that this is a team that's pushing all their chips to the middle of the table. That was taken even further the following year when they made that big splash move for Jalen Ramsey. And not only they bring in Jalen Ramsey, they give him a new contract. He's here. This was this team deciding to go all in, knowing that there were certain members of this team, certain members of the core of this team that were on rookie deals that didn't have a lot more time left, right? At that time, they had Christian Wilkins on his rookie deal. Tua's on his rookie deal. Jalen Waddle's on his rookie deal. Javon Holland is on a rookie deal. They've got guys on this team that are inexpensive, and they're pushing all the chips in right now. And I think this was a team that wasn't actually like fully formed yet. And when they made that decision to go all in, when they went in and the offensive line was still put together, it was still a little bit piecemeal, right? They had Teron Armstead. They had Connor Williams. But they still very much had a project in Austin Jackson. They had Rob Hunt that was coming into his own. And that was what they had. And then they had a lot of, spare parts. And then they went out and they brought these other guys in. But remember, famously, before this season started, comments were made about the offensive line and tight end, and Chris Greer joked about, well, I think you guys are maybe a little bit more worried about that than we are. And as the season began, and we saw this second season of the Mike McDaniel system locking in, and Tua was getting rid of the ball quickly, and we weren't seeing a lot of the deficiencies of the offensive line because of how well, things were working. The system was working. Tua was 2 steps, get rid of the ball. He was not holding onto the ball. And so that the deficiencies of that offensive line were covered up. But as the season wore on and teams started to get a handle on what it was that the Dolphins were trying to do, and to be fair, a couple of injuries occurred, we started to see those deficiencies become a bit more clear. And at the end of the day, you had this system that was so specific and put in place that the Dolphins were not in a place where they could pivot away or do anything else, because this was the only thing that this offense was built to do. And if it couldn't do that, well, it couldn't do anything.
Yeah. And I look, I don't want to go completely crazy about like blaming this season on the offensive line, because the fact is, while yes, the offensive line's limitations were somewhat exposed as the season went on and you best defenses in the league, I don't think that the offensive line is the reason why the Dolphins lost this year. I mean,
that's fair.
It is a reason. It is a reason.
Yes.
But and to the point, as far as reason number 2, as far as putting this thing together before the foundation was fully set, part of the result when you do that, when you say definitively, we're going all in on this team, even though we're not really there yet, what you end up doing is you end up basically trying to fill in pieces, and there are specific parts that say, well, ideally this isn't how we would build it, but because we're building it to win right now, we have to have this part, and then we can win it by doing this. And there's just so many variables at that point. And so what happens is when 1 or 2 things go wrong, you don't have the answer. And by 1 or 2 things going wrong, I'm not even talking about playing, your opposing team and they're a good defense and they take something away. I'm talking about 1 or 2 guys get injured, and now you're putting in a backup offensive lineman who, has his own skill set and can be serviceable, but now he can't do the things that you need that position to do in order for this offense to work at optimum level, not even at optimum level, just at, a good level. And so it's just, this team was built so fragilely, which is what is going to happen when you put it together so quickly, because you're not putting it together with a clear vision over years to build a foundation and then build on top of that foundation and have pieces that are, even if they're not necessarily ready, they fit in that same stew. They're the same ingredients, even though they're not ready, and you throw them in there because at least they're the same style of player. We just kind of put it through a mishmash of parts behind these guys, and it's not that they were all bad players. They just don't all fit together because they just kind of threw it all together because they were so intent on winning quickly. But when you think about, well, why didn't the foundation work? Because we gave them plenty of time, because they had this whole teardown in 2019 or whatever. And they had all these draft picks and all this. So they did have plenty of time. And the goal was always to win when you're in Tua's rookie year. The problem is you failed on the offensive line.
You failed on the offensive line is a big part of it. The other big part of it is you literally changed horses midstream because you fired Brian Flores after 2 years of the rebuild. And so you spent the first couple of years of that rebuild going in a certain direction, building a team with a certain personality. And then you fire Brian Flores, and who knows what the reason truly is. You know, if maybe he didn't want to go along with the tank, and then it comes back to that, right? So, I mean, this hole goes deep, right? This rabbit hole goes down and down and down. But the fact is, a lot of it comes back to that moment. That moment, I mean, and you could even take it back further, even goes back to hiring Brian Flores, a guy who, at the time that you hired him, was going to be fine to go along with the tank, and then made the decision that he didn't want to go along with the tank. So they screwed up tanking, right? Like, let's not forget, if this team had tanked the way that they were supposed to tank, right, or that they were supposedly trying to tank, it goes all the way back where they end up with the number one pick of the draft.
Lose to the Bengals.
All they had to do was lose that game, and this would be an entirely different conversation. Probably because the quarterback would be different, but that's a whole other conversation, right? So, I mean, a lot of it comes back to that, right? The whole thing, it's built shoddily. And so now you've got, I think 2 years of building towards the Mike McDaniel team. You're only going to be so far down that road, and you've got to go further to continue to flush that system out, right? But one of the big things is that what seems to be at the heart of this Mike McDaniel version of Chris Greer's Miami Dolphins is that the heart of this build, and this is the third thing that we were talking about in response to why the team was built this way. It was built this way because of the specific skill set and the specific limitations of Tua Tagovailoa. That's why this team was built this way. And particularly this season, it was built that way because you've got Tua Tagovailoa, who is in a different mental space now because of how badly he battled concussions the year before. Because of the concussion issue and the fact that he was, at one point, apparently actually seriously considering walking away from the game of football, you now have this guy who is playing the game and in a mindset where he has to get rid of the ball as quickly as possible. And I'm not trying to get into this guy's head, but he is clearly, just from watching, anytime that ball wasn't out of his hands in 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds, there seemed to be panic setting in. And this is a guy who's now worried about getting hit. And he's got a system that doesn't want him to get hit. And they want him to continue to take care of himself. And so that is another part of this issue. And among Tua's shortcomings are his ability, or inability rather, to play outside of the structure that Mike McDaniel has set up for him. And I want to preface this. I want to say that we're just going to go down this quarterback road, but this is not a situation where we're completely absolving Mike McDaniel of anything, because I think there's a good part of the reason the season fell to where it is fell on Mike McDaniel's shoulders. But again, there's only so much Mike McDaniel can do with this structure that he has created that is now breaking down everywhere. But there was I listened to a lot of football podcasts in various forms, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's audio only, because I like to get a sense of other thoughts and analysis, and I like to hear different opinions. And I was listening to an episode of the Athletics football podcast with Robert Mays and Nate Tice. And this was, I may have been right. I may have been the recap after week 18. And they made a comparison on this episode of the show where they compared Tua to Jared Goff in terms of how Tua was functioning in Mike McDaniel's offense and how Jared Goff was operating in Sean McVay's offense. And he said they were similar, where the comparison was made was Sean McVay eventually making the decision to move off of Jared Goff, because Jared Goff, as much as he could function really well within the structure of the offense that Sean McVay had created, it was clear that when things began to break down to a certain point, he was just limited to what he was going to be able to do. Right? And you saw that very clearly, happened to be in the Super Bowl. But when Bill Belichick's New England Patriots were up against Sean McVay's LA Rams, Jared Goff was seeing ghosts all over the place. He didn't know what to do because what he wanted to do wasn't there, and he couldn't figure out what to do next. And I think there was a lot of that with Tua Tagovailoa in Mike McDaniel's offense as it stands right now. There is a lot of Tua being able to, when things are functioning the way they should, and they are on time, and they are correct, and they're running the right way in that offense, Tua lights it up. He's perfect. Two-step drop, bang, boom, beautiful passes, downfield, crossers, everything looks good, it's on time, he looks fantastic. Because that's his skill set, is being able to make that first read and pull that trigger and make that decision quickly. And he's an incredibly accurate passer to get the ball exactly where he wants to go most of the time. But when things break down, when teams decide to gum up the works and make it so that what Tua wants to do isn't there, and he has to play off schedule, that's where he struggles. I mean, look at a case in point is the interception that he threw in this game, in that first interception, when he was pressured and the pocket was collapsing and he had to, and it wasn't like a horrible pocket situation. I mean, it was clearly just like a step up in the pocket a little bit and you can make this pass, but he got off schedule. It messed up his footwork and it resulted in the pass going over the receiver's head and getting picked off. He struggles off schedule. He struggles outside of the structure of the offense. And that is a significant limitation that the Dolphins are dealing with. And when you talk about the fact that Mike McDaniel's offense is only meant to do a very specific thing, and it's so timing-based and it's so specific, when you've got a quarterback that isn't able to, things are breaking down, let me go make a play for myself and figure this out, when that's the case, you're left with the kind of offensive performance that you saw from the Dolphins on Saturday night in Kansas City. And so, Brain, I want to get your thoughts on this, because I think a good chunk of this falls on the shoulders of our quarterback being pretty limited, particularly against the best teams who are built and smart enough and well coached enough to slow down what Mike McDaniel wants his team to do.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with that. I think that I've always said that Tua has limitations. I've never been one that has said that Tua is an elite quarterback. I do think that Tua, what he's shown in his body of work over the last 2 seasons now, is that he is probably a top 10 quarterback. Now, obviously, with what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, I'm wavering a little bit on that. I think you can make the argument that maybe he's not quite a top 10 quarterback. But I think that you basically are splitting hairs once you get past a certain level, because I think really what there is there's a very small group. There is a handful of really elite quarterbacks. I think it's Mahomes. I think it's Josh Allen. I think Joe Burrow's in that group. Lamar Jackson is in that group.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
What do all those guys have in common?
Well, they have a lot in common.
Okay, well, let me give you one thing.
Okay.
They all play in the AFC.
Okay. Well, yeah, but I mean, you don't need to have an elite quarterback to win the Super Bowl.
That's true. Trent Dilfer won a Super Bowl.
But I'm not even saying that you need, like, I'm not saying that you need that you, because if you're going to have Trent Dilfer, then you need everything to be perfect. You need to have an all-world defense. You need to have a great running game. What I'm saying is that Tua is, at the very least, a solid quarterback. I think that he's in a tier of guys. Now, the thing that we've seen now, and I think it's pretty apparent, is that anybody that wants to go out there and say that Tua is better than Josh Allen, you're going to get
insanity.
laughed out. It's insanity. It's stupid. It's always been insanity, but people, we've kind of said, well, let's wait and see what happens in the playoffs, and then we'll be the judge of that. But we kind of knew, like, he's not on that level. He's not on the Mahomes level. He's not on the Joe Burrow level. But the thing is, there's only a handful of guys. And then there's going to be a couple other. Maybe what Jordan Love is doing is showing that Jordan Love is going to be on that level. Maybe CJ Stroud is going to be on that level. And then outside of those guys, who you got? Because when you start looking at the next guys that you want to bring up, people are going to say, well, what about Jalen Hurts? And I know Jalen Hurts is injured right now, but the Eagles are falling pretty fast. And Jalen Hurts did not have a good season. And if you take away 1-yard runs, Jalen Hurts is a pretty, subpar or pretty average quarterback at best. Justin Herbert can't win a thing, has been criticized for the same things that Tua is criticized for, but turns the ball over a whole lot more. Dak Prescott, I think, maybe a little bit better than Tua, is also a little bit more seasoned than Tua, but he can't win a big game at all to save his life. He looked awful in the playoffs. And then it's like, all right, well, who's the next guy? Who's the next? And what you end up with is about, because what are you going to say? Well, Trevor Lawrence. Well, this guy's a phenom. This guy was the number 1 pick. Look what he was doing all year. And look at how the season ended for him. And it's like, all of these guys have their warts. And so, like, what are you going to do? Like, yes, it's a lot easier to win the Super Bowl if you have a top 5 quarterback. It's hard to get a top 5 quarterback. It just is. Did the Dolphins, blow it by not tanking because they could have had Joe Burrow? Sure, but we can't do anything about it. So all you have to do now is you got to look at it as what it is and say, can you win with Tua? And there's there's absolutely a conversation that needs to be had. And the conversation that needs to happen sooner rather than later is not just, can you win with Tua, but the follow-up to that is, how do you structure the contract?
Right.
Because that's the big thing. And we're going to get into that because we're going to do basically a whole show on Tua probably in a week. And the show is going to be about basically, what do you do with Tua? Do you let him play the 5th-year option? Do you extend him? Or do you try to trade him? And frankly, as we sit here right now, I don't know what the answer to that is.
And we don't need to have the answer right now because there's a bit of time. But I think that was a very good tease, a very nice tease to let the people know that as we enter into the offseason here, we are going to be doing a series of shows because there were a series of conversations that need to be had and decisions that need to be made for the Miami Dolphins. So we're going to talk about a lot of the Dolphin players who are on expiring contracts and what the Dolphins' options are for those players. So those are going to be coming up. We'll be doing one a week because this is the season is at its end now. So we will be kind of, the schedule gets reduced. We're not going to be doing 2 shows a week anymore because we don't have to do a game preview every week and we don't have a game review, but we are going to be staying with you throughout the offseason. So over the next several weeks, each show is going to be about a specific player and what the decision should be, or maybe not should be, but what the options are for that player in terms of the Miami Dolphins. So, Brain, you want to give us the rundown of those players who we're thinking about?
Yeah, so it's probably going to be in this order. It might not be. We might even throw an extra player or 2 in. But basically, it's going to be Tua. It's going to be Christian Wilkins. it's going to be Connor Williams, Robert Hunt, Jerome Baker, Xavier Howard. Well, it's probably going to be Xavier Howard, Andrew Van Ginkel, and then Jerome Baker. And that's probably it. And if I did the math correctly, I think if we do one show a week, we might need to double up 1 week to get those all in before the start of the legal tampering period.
Yeah, and I think it would make sense to do Baker and Van Ginkel in the same show. It kind of works out there. Not to do a production meeting here on air, but I think that's a good place to double up there. There may be other options as well. So we'll be getting into this. So those are shows that you can look forward to as we go through the off season here. But I think it's important to say here that while there is a question and a conversation to be had about whether or not the Dolphins can win with Tua, I think the other question is really not a matter of, you shouldn't be asking the question, can the Dolphins win with Tua? Really, the question that you should be asking right now is, how can the Dolphins win with Tua? Because at the moment, there is not a viable option for the Dolphins to move forward without him. I doubt I could be proven wrong, but I just looking at the landscape of NFL quarterbacks that might be available, whether it's guys that are going to be in free agency or guys that other teams are moving off of, if it's Kyler Murray, Justin Fields, who else is out there? These quarterbacks that might be free agents or trade chips. I don't know that there's anybody out there that I would want to spend draft capital on to replace Tua with, because I don't know that there's anybody out there that is necessarily better than Tua that would be available at this point. So I think the question should be, how can the Dolphins win with Tua, at least in the short term? Because I don't know that there's anybody coming in the doors that's going to replace him and be an upgrade. I don't even know that there's a lateral move, frankly, based on how this team is built and constituted right now. So that's just a preview of the Tua episode that's coming your way. But I think that's really the question to look at this point. But Brain, as we head into this offseason, there are a number of other questions that need to be asked. And I think among them, among the questions that need to be asked is about Mike McDaniel. I think Mike McDaniel is a great coach. I do not give a lot of credence to the idea that he needs to change his approach. I don't buy into that at all. The idea that he needs to be more hardcore and that he needs to stop with the joking, or that he needs to do. I don't buy into any of that. I think his personality is what it is, and I think his personality is what has allowed so many people to buy in to this Dolphins team in that locker room. If there's one thing that we don't really hear a lot about, is that there's not a lot of dissent in the locker room. We don't have a lot of issues. In the couple of years that Brian Flores was here, it seemed like every week, almost, not every week, that's maybe a little extreme, but it was not an uncommon occurrence for us to hear about a disgruntled player, or this person or that person, getting into it with Brian Flores and whether it was Tua himself, whether it was Minkah Fitzpatrick, whether it was Kyle Van Noy, there were all kinds of people that were butting heads with Brian Flores, right? And you don't tend to hear a lot about that with Mike McDaniel. And I think that is to his credit. And I think, a lot of the issues that some people have with Mike McDaniel is because, he is such a sort of different and unique personality in the locker room that's why you have some people that say that, he needs to be harder, he needs to cut with the joking, he needs to blah, blah, blah. I don't buy into that. I think that his style works for him. But that is not to say that he has always had the greatest solutions during the game. We've talked about it at length on this podcast, that Mike McDaniel, I think, is a great brain when it comes to building and constructing an offense. He's very good at that. Putting a scheme together, he's very good at. But his situational play calling throughout the course of the season has left a lot to be desired at certain times. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. I mean, look no further than this Kansas City game. It was, you're running the ball really, really well. You get yourself close to midfield and you have a 3rd and 2, and then you pass the ball twice. Now, granted, part of that is you've got a quarterback who failed to execute. And that's a major problem of Tua's. I mean, in that Tua conversation, it has to be about the fact that he consistently falls short against the best opposition and consistently falls short in December and January. That has to be part of that conversation too. But again, Mike McDaniel, and I haven't listened to, I know Mike from Dolphins Talk just did a whole episode where he talking about Mike McDaniel being one of the weakest links in how the Dolphins do. And I haven't listened to that argument from him yet. But Brain, I mean, without understanding the basic premise of what Mike was talking about there, let's address the shortcomings that Mike McDaniel has, because they've been on display, I think, throughout this season.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered him ad nauseum, like his impatience. I think the whole I think this is like Andy Reid was guilty of this for years and years and years. And I think a lot of offensive minded coaches or, quarterbacks that basically have carte blanche to run whatever they want have had this issue, which is you have a higher expected return on a pass play than you do on a running play. So when you have a good running or when you have a good passing game and you get a specific look, it is their inclination to lean on the passing game. And the problem is that there's also a lot of variables in the passing game. And it's a lot harder to make the passing game work because of it. And sometimes it is better to run the ball, because even if you're only getting a couple of yards, sometimes those couple of yards are all you need to keep the sticks moving. And sometimes by doing that, you actually make passing the ball a lot easier down the stretch. And so I think first and foremost, there needs to be an adjustment in the commitment to running the football, and not just the commitment to running the football and going out there and, looking at it at the end of the game and saying, well, we didn't run the ball enough, but also letting the opposing defense dictate what you do. Because what the Dolphins are doing is they're basically saying, if you put 8 guys in the box, we are going to throw the football. But if you put 7 guys in the box, we might run the football if the situation calls for it. And so what that's telling the opposing defense is, well, if you've got a down and distance that makes sense for them to run the football, and then let's dare them to pass. Let's dare them to either run the ball against an 8-man box or dare your quarterback to beat us. And I think that are there times where you're going to say, yeah, well, the quarterback needs to be able to beat them with the pass when they have an 8-man box. Sure. But when you're in inclement weather and you've got receivers that are banged up and you don't really have the matchups, and you have an opportunity where you need to get 2 yards, or you have 2 plays to get 2 or 3 yards because of where you're at on the field, you need to be able to run the football. And if you're scared to do it, the offense will never reach they'll never be as good as we think it can be, because it will always be lacking that element. And so that's, I think, those 2 things, the commitment to running the ball and staying patient, and also not being afraid to run the ball against heavy boxes and say, we don't care. We're going to run the ball. we're telling you we're going to run the ball, and we're still going to run the ball. Because you know who does that and who has success with it? The Philadelphia Eagles, the San Francisco 49ers, the Baltimore Ravens, the Buffalo Bills. All of those teams do. Even to a certain extent, the Kansas City Chiefs. But at the end of the day, the Chiefs basically go the other way, and they say, well, we've got Patrick Mahomes, and we could do whatever the hell we want because we have Patrick Mahomes. But basically, those teams, when they want to run the ball, they will. And more often than not, they're going to have success. And that's the difference.
Yeah. And so that's something that McDaniel's going to need to improve on as we go forward as well. And maybe part of that is going to come with, having more opportunity to build this team and continue to find the form of this team that is going to win a Super Bowl. But we're not there yet. And so that's how we go into the offseason. So now, Brain, with the season in a rear view, I mean, is there anything else that you're kind of feeling? I mean, because we've got one more segment to do here in the show, but before we get to that, I wanted to see if there was anything else that you wanted to talk about in terms of just general takeaways from this entire regular season. And I guess the playoff game too. So we'll say the 18 games that the Dolphins played this year, if there's any other takeaways for you.
You mean aside from the fact that unlike the Dolphins, the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City are not fading down the stretch?
I mean, we could talk about that, but we'll save that for later.
No, I think we've basically covered everything on this team. We know what the shortcomings of this team were. Failure to commit to the running game, Tua not being good enough. Well, I'll say this. This is something that we haven't touched on today, and we haven't really touched on all season. And that is, and this is sort of a defense of Tua, is that you really don't have much depth at wide receiver.
No, that's true. That's true.
Because, Tyreek Hill is outstanding. And Jalen Waddle is great, but Jalen Waddle has basically been playing hurt all season. Really, he's had these things, and certainly down the stretch. And I don't think it's a coincidence that with Jalen Waddle out, the offense has struggled, or with Jalen Waddle playing at 70%, the offense has struggled. I think that there's a correlation there. But the bigger issue is well, if Jalen Waddle doesn't play, or if Tyreek Hill is out, well then, do we have nobody else that can beat man coverage? Is there anybody else on this roster? There's not a tight end that scares you. There's not a wide receiver that scares you, which speaks to, again, the fragility in the way this team was built, because they just kind of slapped it together and said, well, we've got two really great wide receivers, and as long as those two guys are healthy, then our offense works perfectly. But the second one of them goes out, all of a sudden our offense becomes, very easy to solve.
That is a big thing that you looked at. And the Dolphins tried bringing in other people, but they've got Robbie Chosen, who is basically just, he can run straight and he can run fast. They've got Chase Claypool, who I don't know what the deal is with him. They tried, he just did not work out at all. They had Eric Ezukama, who is that big physical wide receiver, and then he had this injury come up that supposedly is not a career-threatening injury. So I guess he's somebody that we can look forward to being back in the process next season for the Dolphins. But I mean, otherwise you've got Craycraft, you've got Berrios, you've got Cedric Wilson, and none of these guys are really, they're not world beaters. They're all good pieces that, that if you've got more guys that are taking the defense's attention, that could perhaps help. They'll be available to make plays every now and again, and they can run through zones and stuff like that. But these are not like these. Again, the second half of that game against Buffalo, they couldn't beat man coverage. These guys. So it was just, the Dolphins need at least another couple of receivers. And I think having a big body receiver, a big physical receiver, I'd say if there was one general thing that I think I would love to see this Dolphins team do, is become more physical going into the 2024 season. 100%. Because the Dolphins did nothing to dispel the narrative that this is a team that is just a finesse team. They did nothing to shut up that narrative, because again, they would get punched in the face And then there was nothing else that they could do. They had no response. So yes. And then I guess the other thing that I would say that we haven't really discussed, Brain, was year one of the Fangio system, Brain. What kind of grade do you give Vic Fangio and his defense? Obviously, with the understanding that by the end of the season, you had basically lost every single one of your pass rushers.
Yeah, overall, Vic Fangio did a good job. This defense, when it was whole, was really, really good. He did not draw up his best game plan against Buffalo. He did okay against Buffalo in the last game of the season. The Baltimore game was not a great game plan. But I also think a lot of it is, again, guys being out and execution, but like that was pretty bad preparation in the Baltimore game. But overall, the defense performed. I mean, there was a very slow start out of the gate, which was to be expected because they were learning a complex system, a brand new system with a lot of guys that had never been in it before.
And missing their best cornerback.
And then when guys got healthy, all of a sudden, this was a top 5 defense. It absolutely was. And then guys got hurt. So I don't blame Fangio. And then even at the end, when everything, ends, the defense in the Buffalo game and in the Kansas City game was bend but not break almost to perfection. Because if you don't get the stupid Christian Wilkins personal foul, you give up 22 points to Kansas City in that game? And I'm not going to sit here and say that the defense played well in that game. Defense didn't play well in that game. Hell, the defense didn't really play well in the Buffalo game either. They were overmatched in both of those games, but they kept you in it. And that's when you've got the kind of injuries that the Dolphins have had going into those 2 games against those 2 opponents, for your defense to keep you in it. That's really all you can ask for. And no other coordinator is going to come in and magically make this team better. You've got arguably the best coordinator in football. If it can't work, you got to look somewhere else as far as the reasons why. I'm not saying he's that he's above criticism and that he can do no wrong, but like when you look at the reasons why this team failed, Vic Fangio, I can't even put him in like the top 5 of reasons why this team failed.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. And that was a unit that really wasn't very healthy, wasn't at max health the entire season, really. I mean, what did we get? Like, you got 2 weeks, got the Raiders game and most of the first Jets game on Black Friday, and that was kind of it.
Yeah, well, I would say basically from the Patriots, from when you got Jalen Ramsey back to when Jalen Phillips got hurt, this team was basically at full strength. I mean, you had X miss a game here and there, but overall, you had this team with the most important pieces basically there. This team was built basically, the skeleton of this defense was built around basically 4 guys on the front, 2 corners, and a safety. So you've got Ramsey, X, and Javon Holland in the back. And then you've got your 2 stud defensive tackles and Wilkins and Sealer. And then you've got Chubb and Jalen Phillips. And Andrew Van Ginkel was a nice piece that you could supplement there. And that's really what that was the core of this defense. And that was the vision of this defense. And you got about, I guess, 5 weeks of that. And then it started to fall apart really quickly from the Jets game and then the Titans game. And then it kind of just snowballed on you.
Yeah. All right. Well, the season is at an end, and this is going to feel really weird to do, given everything that is going on and how things just generally feel. But let's check our pulse.
I mean, check your pulse if you're not fired up.
That's right. It's time once again for a Dolphins Talk Pulse Check. This is where we ask you for one word to describe how you are feeling right now about the Miami Dolphins. So, if you're watching on the Dolphins Talk YouTube channel, let us know in the comments what is one word to describe how you are feeling as the Miami Dolphins season came to an end on Saturday night in a 26-7 loss at Kansas City. If you're watching on the I'm a Miami Dolphin fan Facebook page, let us know in the comments. We want to hear about it. We want to hear what your words are. Brain, well, I'll start with you. What's your word?
So I really didn't think I was going to have this word because of the way that this team rebuilt after basically pleading for this team to rebuild the right way for about 15 to 20 years. They finally did it the right way, at least began to do it the right way when they tore everything down. And it was all about flexibility and, always having draft capital and always having, multiple ways and not feeling like you were tied to any one specific contract or multiple contracts. And then you just felt like, well, when you finally get to that point, you're going to be in your winning window and you're going to feel good about, your chances every year. And after what we just saw over the last 3 weeks, I hate to say it, but I feel stuck. Because after all of that, and after all of the numbers and the stats, this team finds itself in a very familiar position. A position that they found themselves in for years under Jay Fiedler. A position that they found themselves in for years with Ryan Tannehill. And now they find themselves in the position with Tua Tagovailoa at quarterback. And that position is, we're clearly not on the same level as the best teams in the league and in the conference. And I'm not sure how conceivable it is or what the pathway is for us to get to that level in this current iteration of the build. And I'm not saying it can't be done. And we're going to do a lot. And this is where the offseason is going to be really kind of fascinating. And I love, personally, to me, the offseason is more fun than the regular season. I mean, of course it is.
Because the Dolphins are like 35-time offseason champions.
Yeah. But just in general, I really enjoy the offseason and the build of things and the decision making that goes into it, because at the end of the day, that's really like you like to refer to poker a lot. You like to make a lot of poker comparisons or metaphors. And, what do you say about poker? It's all about like mitigating the luck factor, or that's basically, doing everything that you can to minimize the luck factor. Well, the way that you build the team, if you build the team the right way, then you mitigate the luck factor. And so I'm really fascinated because they have kind of painted themselves into a corner where they don't have a lot of options, and they have a lot of decisions. So it's kind of weird because it's like, well, you don't have very many options, but you have so many decisions to make that you could kind of go like 8 different ways with it and how you deal with it. And the thing is I'm not sold that any of those ways are leading to a championship. So at this point, we'll explore that all off season, but right now I'm feeling pretty stuck.
Yeah, I think that's a word that a lot of people feel like. I mean, here we go. Dolphins talk, desolate, Patrick Mullen trapped, Golski ruminative, Daniel GC disappointed, Wildman reality, Do the right 11, disappointed. Kiko is dejected. Adam Schultz, pessimistic. Daniel, resigned. Jorge, numb. Dominicus is Harbaugh. It's that word. Gaby McKay, bereft, a great one. John Mancuso, bums. Brent Barron, deceived. Alex, lolfins. Nick, deflated. Aaron Henderson, hopeful. I mean, all of this. Forlorn is T. Hutch. Ben is disappointed. Jack Ross, fatigued. Foretold, disgusted, disappointed. Everybody, like, so much of this. Sell is, I think the Dolphin end zone is sell is their word. I mean, and I, don't disagree with that one. So, I mean, this is generally the theme here. And as we go into our chat here, you can see we've got some similar nauseous from Garrett, Cliff D, pathetic, Daryl Woodard, resigned, Bobby B, apathetic, Jordan Murray, crushed, Douglas Potter, apathetic, Marissa, heartbroken, Kevin Clements, disappointed, betrayed is Manolo, Basketball Jones is unsurprised, Joe is flatline, David says sucks. Mike Newhouse is catfished. Alfred Gilliam disappointed. TC is tired. Ralph typical. Tony angry. Raphael diarrhea. How about that one? And then we got Chris groundhogged. Yeah, I mean, hard to disagree with any of these. And Brain, when it comes back to mine, I'm feeling very similar to yours because I feel like we find ourselves, and I'm not saying that I have completely given up faith that this team is going to be better, but I am at a point where I am having serious doubts about the quarterback, and we'll get into that more as we do the quarterback episode when we get there. But I have doubts about that. And and that sucks because he's going to be the quarterback for at least the next, couple of years, barring some sort of, major injury or something like that. And so, Brain, I feel like I am in purgatory again with the Miami Dolphins. We're just here where it feels like we're getting good, but it's the same results. It felt like we were making progress, but the result is the same, right? Somebody, optimistic fans will say we won 11 games this year. And I'll say that's terrific. That's true. We did win 11 games this year, but we lost at the first hurdle the same way we lost at the first hurdle last year. And the same way that, and that last year was the big step forward, right? Making the playoffs. That was the big thing that we did, even though we definitely limped across the finish line into the playoffs. But we made the playoffs, right? This was the year that we were supposed to make the playoffs and win a game. We didn't make the playoffs. I mean, we did make the playoffs, but we didn't win a game. We didn't win the division. We didn't really take a step forward, because we still finished second place in the division. And as wonderful as all the offensive numbers were over the course of the season, when the season is over, you're left with the same sour taste in your mouth. And I think the thing was, last year, in spite of the bad ending to the season, you were able to look at it and go, well, we made the playoffs in our first year with Mike McDaniel. We didn't have the starting quarterback. And then we're rebuilding. They brought in Jalen Ramsey. By the time the season started, you were fired up and ready to go. I think the Dolphins are going to have a lot of work to do this offseason to get me to the beginning of next season where I'm at the same level of hype and excitement as I was this year. This really felt like it was supposed to be the year, and we didn't get there. And I know that maybe there's the lesson in that, because that's how sports works. Sometimes you have all of the right ingredients and it's just not your year. I don't know that the Dolphins ever really had all of the ingredients, but it was set up. It was set up for this team to make the run this year. And I'm not going to say it was the injuries that derailed it, because as we saw, the team got figured out and they weren't able to pivot and they weren't able to find another way forward. So next year, we're going to have to hope that this team can take another step forward, and that step forward being that when plan A doesn't work, that this time there will be a plan B. And so that the team can find that way forward to hopefully win a division and win a playoff game. But they're not there yet. And so at least for now, it is yet another year of purgatory. And to throw a little salt in the wound, the Detroit Lions won their first playoff game since 1991, which means that your Miami Dolphins possess the longest playoff win drought in the entire National Football League. Since the last time the Dolphins won a playoff game, every single other team in the NFL has won at least one playoff game. That's brutal. But we're going to have to wear it because this is the bed we've made. Brain, any parting words for the people before we get out of here?
This sucks. This really sucks right now. And look, I think at this point, a couple things, and like at the end of the day, you're fans, you're going to do whatever you want. I don't like telling people how to fan. Maybe I do. I don't know. But if you're a fan that thinks that the Dolphins are getting a raw deal in the national media, wake up. If you're a fan that thinks that it's unfair for other fans of this team to criticize the quarterback, the head coach, the GM of this football team, wake up. Like it's all fair game. I'm not going to be mad. Like up until a few weeks ago, I thought it was pretty dumb, really, for people to say that the Dolphins needed to move on from Tua. And now, even while I'm not necessarily in that school of thought that the Dolphins need to move on from Tua, I think there is legitimately a conversation that needs to be had, and it is definitely debatable. It is not a no-brainer by any stretch. Everything needs to be looked at from top to bottom on this thing. The problem is that you're in the middle of the build, and so there's only so many things that you can fix. And so I think whatever this team decides to do, the most important thing is that they have a decisive, clear vision. And that, probably more than anything else, has been the biggest weakness of Chris Greer in his entirety, of whether he's GM or head of scouting or whatever his position is. This team has constantly gone through 2 to 3 year builds and then switch directions. They've never really committed to anything. And so whatever they decide to do at this pivotal point, because this is a very pivotal offseason, the decisions that they make this season will absolutely set this team up for either success or failure over the next 3 years. Although they're doing it on a foundation that's already basically been set. They have to do so with a clear vision, because it can't just be, well, we're going to do this and then next year decide, well, this didn't quite work out, so we're going to blow the whole thing up. Because you're not really in a position to do that. There's not really anything that behooves you to do that at this point, or even next season. So I think they have to practice a little bit of patience, but at the same time, there has to be urgency.
I like that. It's well said. And that's where we're going to leave it. So again, we will be back with you in the weeks to come, looking at the players that the Dolphins need to make decisions on, because there's some options out there. So we're not going away. We're not going away. We hope that you won't go away. And listen, you're Dolphin fans. You're gluttons for punishment. So come take that punishment with us as we go through the off season, which is in some ways, as the brain said, the best time of year to be a Dolphin fan. So stick with us here. Make sure you're following us at Amplified to Rock, at Aaron the Brain, at Same Old Dolphins. Download, rate, review, and subscribe to the Same Old Dolphin Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, everywhere you get your podcasts. Subscribe to the Dolphins Talk YouTube channel. Smash that like button. Smash it. Thank you very much. We will be back with you right here next week with the next episode of the Same Old Dolphin Show, unless like major news breaks between now and then, in which case we'll probably be back reacting to it. But maybe we'll do the Danny Crossman got fired show if and when that happens. Imagine it doesn't. That'd be really something, wouldn't it? But we'll be back here with you next week in all likelihood. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. And as always, go Dolphins!
Real Housewives of Salt Lake City reunion part 2. So pumped.